Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Silver Bullion Television, SBTV. I'm your host, Patrick Vieira. Today we have with us Mr. Gregor Gregersen, the founder of Silver Bullion, and he's here today to talk to us about being an asset owner and not a creditor when it comes to having your bullion in storage. Good day, Gregor, and welcome to SBTV.
Patrick, good seeing you again.
Yeah, good to
see you every day.
Yeah, okay, we kind of know each other.
Yeah.
So, Gregor, could you start by just sharing a little bit about your background and how you got into the precious metals business?
Yeah, so everything started in end of 2008. At the time, I was working as a senior data architect for Commerzbank, second biggest bank in Germany. And I was in the trading room shortly after Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. And the idea of counterparty risk became very real at that point. What I mean with counterparty risk is, as Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, there was a bank in Germany which transferred about $50 million a few hours before Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. And it was widely ridiculed as being the dumbest bank in Germany. And nobody wanted to be the next dumbest trader by transferring money to another bank. And essentially, the financial system came to a standstill. And when that happens, it's a little bit like looking at the Wizard of Oz and realizing that it's not a wizard after all. And when the clockwork starts to stop, then suddenly this whole house of cards can kind of fall. And at that time, a lot of people ended up going and buying precious metals, gold, silver. And by the time I sort of thought, hey, geez, that might be a good idea, I couldn't get any. And I tried 13 different bullion dealers and bank in Frankfurt, and I eventually got a 1 kg bar at a gift shop of the European Central Bank, paid 90% tax, took it back to Singapore with me, paid another 7% tax on import, and tried to understand what I need to do in order to put my hands on more gold and silver and do so in a safe jurisdiction. Because based on my life experience, I'm sure that we're going to have another crisis, which will be much worse than 2008. And this time around, we're not going to have bailouts, we're going to have bail-ins. And I think everybody should protect themselves with some gold and silver. And I think it's very important for people to understand how to do that, because I did not want to start this company initially. I wanted to just buy some gold and secure myself, and I discovered a lot of problems along the way. And I spent the last 9 to 10 years more or less trying to tell people about what I discovered, and I tried to summarize it more and more. And what I'm hoping to do with the series today is to share some of these insights.
It's no secret that cash deposited into bank accounts today, the depositor is seen as a creditor to the bank. From your experience of working with banks, how would you agree with this?
It is a fact. A bank has liabilities and has assets. As soon as you put $100 in the bank, it ceases to be yours. It becomes $100 worth of asset for the bank, and there's a $100 liability towards you. A bank can create more cash using fractional reserve banking and lend out $500 out of that, and thereby enable leverage. And one of the biggest problems we have in our financial system is we have too much leverage. Most of the money that people put in the bank, that money is not there. There's maybe, by law, we maybe says 8 or 9% or something that's supposed to be held there. So we put $100 in, you can maybe expect $9 to be there. And if everybody goes and tries to withdraw some money from the banks, then you have a bank run. Then the government comes in and stops everything because the system will fail. And most people don't understand that. Most people think that the money they have in the bank is theirs. It's not. It's a liability that the bank has towards you. And if the bank cannot fulfill that liability because they go bankrupt or for other reasons, or nowadays decides that they don't want to give you that money, sometimes due to AML reasons, which they don't have to tell you what those reasons are, then you're out of luck. So, and that's the important thing I'm trying to make people understand when are you an owner and when are you a creditor. Because most people think they're owners when they're just creditors.
Okay, so basically we're putting our savings into the bank, and the bank's not really holding it there. It's all being sent out, and they're giving us I.O.Us.
Well, yes, it is an I.O.U. That's nobody will discuss or dispute that. The question is, how safe is the bank? And the bank is, there used to be protections to prevent the bank from doing many things with that cash. Most of these protections have been removed in the 90s, which partially led to the .NEM crisis and other things. And nowadays, the more depth we have in the system, and the more interconnectedness we have in the system, we are at record amounts of debt, the more risks there is. And that risk is becoming more and more bigger, hence the need to put some of your money in something you can truly own.
Right, that obviously would be gold and silver, physical bullion.
It might be land, it might be real estate. It's just that gold and silver is very liquid. You can quickly convert it back into cash, and you always have a price. So it's like a financial product, but it's yet physical. And if you do it the right way, you get the benefit of both.
Now, you built this vault here at the Safe House, and back in 2014, and you designed your Bullion storage system to offer Bullion owners what you would call the safest storage in the world. Now, in the Bullion industry, it's common to hear the terms unallocated, allocated, even segregated. Could you explain what the differences between these types of storage are?
I'm saying the safest place in the world as a way for people to challenge me, because it gives me an opportunity to kind of explain why. Whenever people really care to look deeper into things, then I feel I've sort of done my job. So the terms you mentioned, most gold nowadays really is the price, and most trading is happening on future markets. So that's paper. There's no actual gold behind it. So there's a theoretical way to take delivery of some gold or silver. I've done so before to test it. But there are quite a number of limits. You might only have about 2% backing. And in that sense, I guess we can say that future contracts are what's called unallocated. Essentially what it means is somebody gives you $100 and you buy $1 worth of gold for it. So if somebody is wanting to have all that gold back, then you have a problem. But in reality, you have many different customers coming in, and you really only need to keep a small amount of gold. And if there's more demand, the idea is you buy some more gold in the market, and you can basically use the $98 or $99 you have extra for other purposes. So that's a very good deal for the person issuing unallocated storage. It's not such a great deal for the customer who buys into it. Yet again, most people think they're owners, even in that case. So that's what unallocated tends to mean. Now, allocated, or what you would often hear in the industry, fully allocated, means that if somebody gives me $100 worth of gold, then I will go out and I will buy $100 worth. Somebody gives me $100 worth of cash, I will go and buy $100 worth of gold with it. Now, sounds good in principle, but that still doesn't mean you're an owner, because that gold is on the balance sheet of the dealer or your entity you're buying it from, and it's owing you $100 worth of gold or a certain amount of ounces of gold. Now, the reason why that is a potential problem is that when that gold is on the balance sheet of the dealer can do whatever they want with that gold because it's theirs. So, for example, they can take that gold and use it as inventory. There are many dealers out there, I would say it's a common practice in the industry, to actually take customer gold and use it as inventory, running inventory, in order to pay for the gold stocks that you have. Because it's very expensive to say, raise $20 million worth of inventory. But if you can use customer inventory, which is storing anyway, and it's anyway owned by the company, it's completely legal to use that and finance your inventory through it. The problem I'm having with that from a systemic risk perspective is what's going to happen if we have a financial crisis and if we have a repeat of what happened in 2008. In 2008, all the bullion dealers and banks ended up running out of physical bullion. You could not get new bullion. So if I'm a bullion dealer and I'm taking customer bullion, using it as inventory, what's going to happen is that when a crisis comes, people are going to buy, get the physical bullion, walk out of the store with it, and then I'm left with cash, or the bullion dealer is left with cash, and that cash will then be used to buy new gold. But what if you cannot get any new gold? So what is that dealer going to tell the customers who thought they're storing gold with that entity owned by them? Well, that's when they're going to find out that they never owned that gold, that they were just creditors, because that's what fully allocated means. Fully allocated means that it's on the balance sheet of the dealer, essentially, and I'm having enough gold on that balance sheet to cover my liabilities in general. But you're still faced with that risk of really not being able to get a hold of the physical gold. So that's a risk. Lastly, you were mentioning segregated. Now, there are different words. Some people call it reserved. Some people might call it segregated. Some people might call it something else. In essence, what you want, a prerequisite for you to be an owner of something, is that whatever gold or silver you have has to be uniquely identified. So it has to have a serial number. And if you have a 1 kilo gold bar and it will have serial number XYZZ, and you get an invoice from the dealer saying that that specific bar XYZZ has been sold to you on that date for that amount of money, then that invoice is an accounting entry which is removing it from the balance sheet of the dealer, and it legally becomes your property. So that invoice basically certifies that it's now your property under the law of the jurisdiction where you bought it. But it only works if you know exactly what it is, because if you're just buying, if you're getting a statement, or even if you're an invoice which just said, oh, you bought 50 ounces of gold, and we are storing it for you. Well, what's going to happen? How are you going to go back to that dealer and say, oh, here are my 50 ounces of gold? What's it going to say? Well, where are your 50 ounces? Now, if it actually says bar XYZZ, now you have a specific item which you're the owner of, where you can say, give me that gold. And you have much more control, because the dealer now cannot take that gold and start selling it to somebody else, because it's illegal. And you can check that that bar is indeed in the dealer hand. It hasn't moved because you have that serial number. So segregated, and again, it's a different definition out there, but what it should mean is that there is a bar with your name on it. Now, some dealers might say segregated means that it's still fully allocated, but we put your gold in a little segregated area which is just yours. That doesn't matter, right? Again, what matters is you need to have the serial number of the bar which you own. And when you have a system like this, you cannot own portions of a bar. You cannot own 2/3 of a bar, because that's by definition an I.O.U. That's a liability, because 1/3 is owned by somebody else, which means that again, it's really something that will be on the balance sheet of the dealer, and 2/3 is owed to this person, 1/3 is owed to this person. So you need to own one bar in full, and you might have to buy 10 ounces of silver or 20 ounces of silver. You might not be able to buy 12 ounces of 72, because if you can do that, you're probably looking at fully allocated or unallocated. So that's a prerequisite of ownership.
So it seems like segregated storage would be the priority choice between the three: unallocated, allocated, segregated.
If segregated means you have ownership of a specific bar, because again, a dealer might say segregated and just mean I'm having little place in a vault where I'm just putting your bars, and so it's a matter of definitions. People can say it's a certain word, but it might not mean what you want it to mean. It has to mean that specific bar is yours, and there has to be an audit trail about that bars.
Have you, from your experience and time in the industry, have you ever heard of any questionable or unfortunate situations that arise from the different types of bullion storage?
It's more common, I think, to find basically everybody is doing it, or most of the industry is working that way, which is why we sort of created the safe house from scratch in order to be able to offer something different and be able to talk about it. Now, did we come up with examples? I can tell you that Germany stored very large tonnage of gold at the New York Fed. And at one point, after the crisis of 2008, Germany decided, hey, maybe it's good to move some of that gold back to Germany. And the answer from the New York Fed was, well, we can give you a little bit of gold, but the majority of it, you have to wait 7 years. And I was in Germany back at that time, and the newspapers were full saying, why can't we move it back? There was all this speculation saying, oh, it must be so much gold. It takes 7 years to put it on a ship and ship it back to Germany, and so on and so on. And German auditors were not allowed to go see the gold. So why is that? Well, it's because essentially it might have been a fully allocated storage, so to speak, or unallocated. Say Germany entrusted that gold to the Fed, which basically said, okay, I owe you X number of tons. Now, the Fed is not charging any storage fee on it, which is nice from the Fed. But what most likely is the case is that the Fed, which is a common practice in the industry, takes that gold and actually lease it out to another entity in order to get a revenue from that. Look at it this way. If you have $500 million worth of gold, that's a lot of value. People need gold, right? So the reasoning goes, why not take that gold and lease it, say, to a gold mine? Now, the gold mine, they need a lot of capital in order to get the gold mine going. And they're saying, I'm mining gold anyway. I'll give it back to you. But in the meantime, you give me that gold, I convert it into cash. I'm going to get my mine working, and by so and such date, that leased gold is going to go back to you. Probably not exactly that gold, but some amount of gold. Now, the Fed, or whoever that entity is supposed to, make sure that gold comes back. But essentially what's going to happen is that gold, which is German's gold in that case, might be taken and actually sold to somebody else. So that's an example of what's happening, at very, very high levels. Now, another example which I always like to quote is there's a class action lawsuit against UBS and Morgan Stanley from an investor who stored a sizable amount of gold with Morgan Stanley. And for 2 years, he paid his storage fees. And one day he said, I want to take delivery of some of my gold. Morgan Stanley said, yeah, no problem. We'll write you a check. How much gold would you like to sell back to us? The customer says, no, I want to take delivery. I actually want to have my 100 ounces worth of gold.
Give me my gold, right?
Give me my gold. And, well, they couldn't do that. Why could they not do it? Because there wasn't any gold. Because normally what happens is these banks, they will just buy some future contract to hedge the position. And since there isn't really any actual gold. And the customer ended up going, through the legal system, did a class action lawsuit. And eventually, Morgan Stanley basically, they did not admit guilt, but they settled for $4.4 million. And it was indeed determined that there never was any gold.
Yet he was being charged for storage.
Yet he was being charged for storage fee. And the most telling thing is the defense of Morgan Stanley said, well, it might not be right, but it's industry practice. So that means that, everybody kind of seems to do it, because when you think about it, a bank is not used to thinking in terms of ownership. As soon as you give something to a bank, it's an I.O.U, it's a liability to them. So oftentimes they might not really see that much of a difference between actually having some gold there or just having a future contract and just covering it with paper. After all, somebody came up with the idea of gold being a barbaric relic, right? And oftentimes, this is the very bankers, and I worked in banks for a very long time, that will have that mentality. The problem is the banking system is a house of cards. And once one of the bank starts falling, you can have a ripple effect. And the whole point of owning physical gold is not to have the counterparty risk of that bank. If that bank goes bankrupt, you don't want all of your wealth to go away with it. So that's why, in general, it's not that great an idea to keep your gold with the bank. Now, to come to an example which is a little bit more closer to home, we had some customers which were with storing gold with some other entities, and they decided they wanted to transfer the gold over to us. We have a transfer-in program whereby you can take your gold from home or store it somewhere else. We transfer it in, we will test it, we will make sure it's a real thing, and we will store it for you, and then you can sell it, you can collateralize it, and so on and so on. Now, the gold was supposed to be one of the vaults in Singapore, held there by the dealer from which this customer bought. Now, when he asked for pickup, we thought that the customer thought within a couple of days we should be able to pick it up. I mean, it's just a 20-minute drive from here. But it took 9 weeks before we were able to get it. And actually, after 9 weeks, there was a call saying, "Oh, your gold just arrived in Hong Kong," which is far away from Singapore. So then eventually the gold arrived in Singapore and we were able to transfer it in. But what it showed is that this customer was buying gold, supposedly storing it in Singapore, yet it took 9 weeks to take delivery. And another funny thing that we see is, again, because of a transfer-in system, we have customers who might be transferring in maple leaf coins, which they bought in 2014, for example, and they are transferring them in 2017, and we're getting 2017 maple leaf coins, which means these coins could not have been bought in 2014 because they're 2017 earmarked coins. So it's another indication that these coins have not been reserved, segregated, or whatever you want to call it, uniquely identified as your property. So throughout the industry, it's just so tempting for a dealer or somebody else to treat your storage position as a liability and then do all kinds of things with that money instead of actually taking that gold, storing it, and essentially build a system like we did. Because as you guys know, storing each bar individually for a customer takes about 3 times more space to do. It's more expensive to do. You have to be very careful. You have to have a good IT system to keep track of it. And it's so much more of an hassle than to just take that gold, put it all into one vault, just kind of stack it up and make it a liability. That's the easy way. But we're not doing the easy way. We're doing the right way because we're going to have a crisis happening, and we are the safest place for your gold and silver.
Okay. Yeah, that's I find a lot of comfort in that, especially after hearing that story can be quite unsettling. But could you explain more about how ownership of the bullion is transferred to the person storing gold or silver with the safe house, and how strong of a claim does that person have to ownership?
Well, what I always tell customers is that wherever you store your gold, you ought to be asking at least 4 questions. How do you know the gold is there? How do you know it wasn't sold to multiple people? How do you know that it's not encumbered? And how do you know it's real? Because if any one of these questions cannot be answered, then you've got they should be answered. And those are the questions you should always ask ultimately. Now, when it comes to these points, how do you know the gold is actually there? What we did is, again, we started off with a system where a bar is owned by a specific customer and uniquely identified. So we, as a company, have about $10 million worth of gold and silver that we keep as buffer inventory. When you buy something from us, we show you whether it's in inventory or whether we need to order it. So we have that transparency. Assuming it's already you buy a gold bar and we have it in inventory, we will sell it to you using an invoice. That invoice would have that specific bar, and that invoice is basically what transfers the ownership to you. It's removing it from our balance sheet, and it will then make us an agent who stores your property for you, ensures it provides liquidity, and provides the storage. So what that means in practice is that if we ever were to go bankrupt, our creditors cannot touch that gold because it's not on our balance sheet. A liquidator would have to go in and would then have to look at who owns what and would then have to liquidate it. So it intrinsically makes it a much safer setup for a customer than if it would be fully allocated, because the entity goes bankrupt, you can lose everything. So that's one part of it. The next part is we provide a photo for you of the actual bar, and we have what we call a parcel ownership list. In other words, every bar that we have, we will technically call it a parcel. A parcel might be a bag which has 5 bars in it, or it might be an individual large bar, or a unit which you can buy and sell essentially. And the parcel ownership list lists each parcel in one column, and next to it is the anonymous ID of the owner owning that parcel. It's basically a master list of everything that's stored in the vault. And this list is made available to every customer. Now, because each customer knows their anonymous ID, they can double check on the list that indeed they're the owner of that specific bar. And that ensures that we cannot take one bar and sell it to 5 different customers. Right. Because that's something which will basically break the whole system. And if we don't have a good answer to that, then why should anybody trust us? And that covers that part. In addition to that, we are having physical audits by a company called Bureau Veritas, which does audits 3 times per year, physical. These are sample ones. We test about 20 to 30% randomly selected, and we have to show it to them. And once per year we have PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, doing an audit. So basically we have 2 third parties doing these audits. Now, you don't have to go through all of that extent, but it only makes sense for a third party to be able to actually check that the gold or silver is there. And if you own it by individual ID, it should be audited by ID, not by quantity, because that's the only way you can own something. And if that's the case, you can be quite sure that the bullion really is there. Now, the other advantage of you owning the bullion legally is that it's impossible for us to lease it out to somebody else because it would be illegal. It's not our property. On top of that, if under Singapore law, where we operate, if you were to falsify an invoice, that's not a civil but a criminal offense in Singapore. So again, we are putting ourselves sort of, let's say, in jeopardy in some way if we were to do something funny, because it's the right way to do it. So I always tell everybody that you cannot ask people to trust you, but you can create a system which makes it nearly impossible for you to cheat, and that's how you can earn the trust. And that's essentially what we've been building. And we built the system from scratch. And that's why we had to build our own vault, in order to ensure that we can really do the things the way we wanted and have all of this transparency.
Okay, so basically a client of yours can go online and he can see his parcel and see that it's not owned by multiple people, and also you're being audited multiple times a year.
Yeah, I mean, he can see that we have that parcel can only be owned by one person. And there's an official list who's owning it, and that pretty much makes it very clear who owns that parcel. And by definition, that prevents from us from sneaking around and basically trying to assign it to multiple people. It's basically the system creates transparency. And transparency is something that's thoroughly lacking in the industry. Why do most companies not have this? It's because they're running a fully allocated or an I.O.U.-based system. So there's no bar in the first place for you to own. So it doesn't even make sense to do it. Now, what they might give you is a list of the bars they have. But yes, but it wouldn't have your name behind it. That's a different thing. So you just have to understand the basic concept, which always comes back to the same thing. You ought to be owning a specific bar or bars with a unique ID, and your name has to be associated with that. And an invoice has to certify that. As long as you have that means you have a claim on that bar. And legally, if you have the invoice, that bar is not on the balance sheet of the dealer.
Okay, so I mean, we've been talking about bars. Most of the time, bars would have a serial number. It's a bit more easily identifiable. How about for coins? There's no serial number on coins. Does it go through the same system of parcelization?
Yes, so if you have coins, if you have small bars which don't have serial numbers, in our case, we put it in tamper-evident bags with a unique ID. It's always standardized. It always has to be 5 100-ounce silver bars, for example. Never 6, never 4. It makes it easier for auditing purposes. But essentially, the same thing applies. If you have some item of value, it might be gold, it might be silver, it might be nickel, it might be cobalt in a drum, you need to uniquely identify it, and then we call that a parcel. And if it doesn't come with its own serial number, we'll assign a number, and we put it in a tamper-evident bag.
Okay, so that explains why customers always seem to have a question why do I need to buy a quantity of 5 or a quantity of 10? So that helps to explain the reason why.
Yes.
Some storage facilities, they issue certificates. But what's your opinion on certificates to demonstrate ownership?
Ownership is something that a vault cannot give. Ownership is something that's recognized by the jurisdiction, by the government in which the vault operates. So a certificate, therefore, is just another form of saying I.O.U. It's like a statement. I would say a certificate is worth a lot less than an invoice, because an invoice is a document which is regulated and recognized by a government as certifying transfer of ownership from one person to another one, as long as it specifies what that item is. A certificate is just another way for the bank, for the dealer, or for the company to say, yes, I owe you this. So it's just another form, and so it really doesn't make any difference whether you call it a certificate, a statement, an I.O.U. It's pretty much the same thing.
So should that vault or dealer, let's say, go bankrupt, what good is that certificate?
Well, if the bullion is on the balance sheet of the dealer and the certificate attests that the dealer owes you that gold, it's still a liability. And you have to realize that oftentimes when you're running a business, a lot of businesses, they take loans from banks. When a bank gives you a loan, they typically try to make sure that they have a first interest, meaning that they will get some money back before anybody else. And if you have some gold stored with these entities, you're just a creditor, normally an unsecured creditor, which is quite funny because you actually deposited gold there, yet you're the unsecured creditor. The money will have a first line on it, they will get some money first, and then whatever's left you will be getting. A certificate is just a way of saying, yes, I owe you that, but that's already clear that you're being owed that. It really always comes back to one thing. You're either a creditor, meaning you're being owed something, or you're an owner. And if you are an owner, you need to have a document which certifies the transfer under the law of the land, not some document from the dealer saying that I owe you something. And that's really where perception is so important. It's actually a pretty simple thing. It's just that oftentimes companies try to confuse people, and a certificate somehow sounds better than a statement. But what you do want is an invoice stating that specific bar 2, 3, 4, 5 is indeed yours.
Right. Okay. Well, Gregor, we'd like to thank you for the insight on this first edition of a 4-part installment. This one being on being an asset owner, not a creditor. And that'll wrap up the first part of a 4-part series with Gregor Gregersen, the founder of Silver Bullion and the Safe House. In the second part, we'll be talking about insurance and what every bullion owner who has their bullion in storage should know. Now this is pressure. Interviewing
Don't sweat,
the boss.
don't sweat.
That was Gregor Gregersen, founder of Silver Bullion and the Safe House, in the first of a 4-part series and why you need to know the importance of how storage vaults see you as an asset owner or a creditor. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the SBTV channel to be updated on our new content.